The silence in room 247 was deafening, not because it was quiet, but because it screamed of everything that should have been there but wasn't. Elena Martinez stared at her reflection in the hotel bathroom mirror, still wearing the wedding dress that had cost more than her first car. The intricate lace sleeves felt heavy now, like beautiful chains binding her to a moment that had shattered 3 hours ago. She touched the diamond necklace at her throat, David's grandmother's necklace, and wondered if she had any right to still be wearing it. The Fairmont Hotel's presidential suite stretched behind her like a museum of abandoned dreams. Rose petals scattered across Egyptian cotton sheets that would remain untouched. Champagne growing flat in crystal flutes. Her wedding bouquet, white peonies and baby's breath, wilting in the corner where she'd thrown it after David had whispered those devastating words, "I can't do this, Elena. I'm sorry." Then he'd simply walked out. She pulled the pins from her hair, letting dark waves cascade down her back. Each bobby pin that hit the marble countertop sounded like a tiny funeral bell. In 6 hours, she'd transformed from Elena Martinez, excited bride, to Elena Martinez, abandoned wife. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent her whole life afraid of not being enough, and here was the ultimate confirmation. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister Carmen. "How's married life?" Smiling face with heart-shaped eyes. Elena turned the phone face down. 3 floors below, David Chen sat in his BMW in the hotel parking garage, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He'd been there for 2 hours, engine off, key in his palm, watching couples come and go through the glass elevator. Happy couples. Couples who deserved each other. Not like him and Elena. The wedding had been perfect. Too perfect. Elena floating down the aisle in that dress, her eyes shining with a love so pure it made his chest ache. When she'd said "I do," her voice clear and certain, he'd felt like the biggest fraud alive. How could someone so beautiful, so whole, promise her life to someone like him? The panic attack had hit during their first dance. Elena spinning in his arms, laughing at something he'd whispered, completely unaware that the man holding her was fundamentally broken. His therapist Dr. Williams had warned him this might happen, that the closer he got to real happiness, the harder his trauma would fight back. "You don't deserve her," the voice in his head had whispered during their dance. "She deserves someone who isn't damaged goods. Someone who doesn't wake up screaming. Someone whose hands don't shake when he tries to be gentle." Now he sat in the dark, knowing he'd made the right choice for all the wrong reasons. His phone displayed 17 missed calls from his brother James, 12 from his parents, and 43 from Elena. He'd stopped reading her texts after the first few went from confused to desperate to heartbroken. The last one, sent 20 minutes ago, simply said, "I'm not giving up on us." David closed his eyes. Elena had no idea what she was fighting for. Back in room 247, Elena had finally managed to unzip her dress, though it felt like peeling away her skin. She hung it carefully in the closet. Habit. Her mother had always taught her to take care of beautiful things, then slipped into the silk nightgown her maid of honor had insisted she pack. "For your wedding night," Jessica had winked, not knowing that Elena's wedding night would be spent alone, wondering what she'd done wrong. The suite felt enormous around her. David had booked it months ago, his eyes lighting up as he described the fireplace, the balcony overlooking the city, the oversized bathtub. "Our first night as husband and wife should be perfect," he'd said, kissing her forehead. Perfect. The word tasted bitter now. Elena curled up on the velvet sofa, pulling a throw blanket around herself. The city sparkled beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, millions of lights representing millions of people who weren't spending their wedding night abandoned and alone. She closed her eyes, trying to make sense of the last few hours. David had been quiet during the reception, but she'd attributed that to nerves. He'd always been introspective, thoughtful. It was one of the things she loved about him. When he'd asked her to come upstairs early, she'd been thrilled. Finally, time alone with her new husband. Instead, she'd found him sitting on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. "I made a mistake," he'd said without looking up. "We made a mistake." The words had hit her like ice water. "What do you mean?" "This. Us. The wedding. All of it." His voice had been hollow, distant. "I thought I could be the man you deserve, but I can't. I'm not. I'm not built for this, Elena." She'd knelt in front of him, trying to take his hands, but he'd pulled away. That small rejection had shattered something inside her chest. "David, talk to me. What's wrong? We can work through." "No." He'd stood up, backing away from her like she was dangerous. "We can't. I can't. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so fucking sorry, but I can't do this." And then he'd left, taking her heart and all her certainties with him. Now, hours later, Elena found herself staring at her wedding ring, a simple band that had felt like a promise that morning and felt like a lie now. She twisted it around her finger, remembering the moment David had slipped it on, his hand steady despite the tears in his eyes. Those hadn't been tears of joy, she realized now. They'd been tears of goodbye. What would you do if your new spouse abandoned you on your wedding night? Have you ever felt like you weren't enough for someone you loved? Share your thoughts below. Sometimes our worst moments lead to our greatest breakthroughs. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 11 times. In 1 hour, it would be midnight, and this nightmare of a day would officially end. Maybe tomorrow she could start figuring out how to pick up the pieces of her life. Elena closed her eyes and tried to sleep, unaware that her real wedding night was about to begin in the most unexpected way possible. The clock struck midnight with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through Elena's bones. She'd been drifting in and out of restless sleep on the sofa, her silk nightgown twisted around her legs, when the first sound cut through the silence like a blade. A sob. Raw, broken, and unmistakably male. Elena's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound was coming from somewhere close, too close to be from another room. She sat up slowly, the throw blanket falling away, and listened with every fiber of her being. There it was again. A choking, desperate sound that made her chest tighten with recognition and something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. David. The sound was coming from the balcony. Elena moved like she was underwater, each step toward the French doors deliberate and silent. The silk of her nightgown whispered against her skin as she pressed herself against the wall beside the curtains. Through the sheer fabric, she could see a shadow hunched against the balcony railing. Her husband, God, was he still her husband? Sat with his back to the doors, shoulders shaking with the force of his grief. His tuxedo jacket lay crumpled beside him, his white dress shirt untucked and wrinkled. His dark hair, which had been perfectly styled 12 hours ago, now stuck up at odd angles as if he'd been running his hands through it. But it was the sounds he was making that broke her heart all over again. These weren't the controlled, measured sobs of someone having a moment of doubt. These were the sounds of a man coming apart at the seams, of someone who'd been holding back an ocean and finally let the dam burst. "I'm sorry," she heard him whisper to the night air, his voice hoarse and fractured. "I'm so fucking sorry, Elena. You deserved better than this. You deserved better than me." Elena's hand flew to her mouth, catching the gasp before it could escape. He was talking to her, even though he thought she couldn't hear. Even though he'd abandoned her, he'd come back. He was here, 3 stories above the ground on their wedding night, falling apart just feet away from her. "I wanted to be different," David continued, his voice barely carrying through the glass. "I wanted to be the man in your eyes when you looked at me. But I can't. I can't touch you without seeing his hands instead of mine. I can't hold you without feeling like I'm contaminating something pure." Elena's blood went cold. His hands? Who was he talking about? David's voice broke on a sob that seemed torn from his very soul. 15 years. And I still can't. I tried, Elena. God knows I tried. I thought if I loved you enough, if I wanted it enough, I could be normal. But when you were looking at me tonight, so trusting, so ready to give yourself to me, I knew I'd destroy you. Just like he destroyed me. The pieces began clicking together in Elena's mind with horrible, heartbreaking clarity. David's reluctance to talk about his childhood. His insistence on always keeping the lights on. The way he sometimes flinched from unexpected touches, even hers. His refusal to discuss his father, who died when David was 16. "Oh, David. I should have told you," he was saying now, his words barely audible through his tears. "I should have been brave enough to tell you why I'm broken. But I was so afraid you'd look at me differently. That you'd see what I see, something damaged, something used, something not worth loving." Elena's own tears were flowing freely now, hot tracks down her cheeks that she didn't bother to wipe away. Her heart was breaking, but not for the reasons she'd thought. Not because David didn't love her, but because he loved her so much he was willing to destroy himself to protect her from what he saw as his brokenness. "I love you," David whispered to the stars, his voice raw with anguish. "I love you so much it feels like dying. But I can't. I can't be a husband to you. I can't give you children. I can't be the man who makes love to you on your wedding night because every time I try, I'm 15 again and his words dissolved into a keening sound that Elena felt in her bones, a sound of such profound pain that she couldn't stand it anymore. Her hand was on the door handle before she'd made a conscious decision to move. David. His name fell from her lips like a prayer as she stepped onto the balcony, the cool midnight air raising goosebumps on her bare arms. David's head snapped up, his face a mask of terror and shame in the moonlight. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his cheeks wet with tears he didn't bother to hide. For a moment, they stared at each other across the small space, the abandoned bride in her silk nightgown and the broken groom in his disheveled tuxedo. The city lights twinkled below them like fallen stars, and the night air carried the scent of jasmine from the hotel's gardens. Elena. Her name was barely a breath on his lips. You shouldn't. I didn't mean for you to hear. How long? She asked quietly, moving closer despite the way he pressed himself back against the railing. How long have you been out here? Since I left. His voice was hoarse, destroyed. I couldn't leave. I tried. I sat in the car for 2 hours, but I couldn't drive away from you. So I came up the fire escape. I needed to be near you, even if I couldn't be with you. Elena's heart cracked open at his words. He'd spent their entire wedding night 3 feet away from her, separated by nothing but glass and his own pain, tearing himself apart rather than contaminate her with his trauma. David, she said softly, taking another step toward him. Look at me. I can't. He closed his eyes, fresh tears leaking from the corners. I can't look at you knowing what you heard. Knowing that you know what I am. What you are. Elena's voice sharpened with a fierce protectiveness that surprised them both. What you are is my husband. What you are is the man I chose to love. What you are is someone who survived something terrible and still found a way to love me. David's eyes flew open, meeting hers with desperate hope and terror warring in their depths. You don't understand, he whispered. I'm damaged, Elena. Broken. I can't give you a normal marriage, a normal wedding night. I can't even touch you without. Then don't. The words hung between them in the night air, simple and profound. Don't touch me, Elena said, her voice steady despite her tears. Not tonight. Not until you're ready. But don't you dare leave me again, David Chen. Don't you dare make that choice for both of us. She moved closer, stopping just out of arm's reach, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin but far enough that he wouldn't feel trapped. For better or worse, she said softly, her eyes never leaving his. In sickness and in health. Those weren't just pretty words, David. They were a promise. And I meant every one of them. David stared at her like she was an angel, terrible and beautiful in her fierce love. You don't know what you're saying. You don't know what it means. Then tell me, Elena said simply. Tell me what it means. Help me understand so I can love you better. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of the city below and the thundering of 2 hearts learning how to beat in sync. David's hands trembled on the railing, and Elena could see the war raging behind his eyes, the desperate want to believe her warring with years of shame and self-hatred. Finally, in a voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it, he said, I was 15 when my father started coming to my room at night. The words fell into the space between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would change everything. Elena didn't gasp. She didn't cry out or step back or show any of the reactions David had feared and expected. Instead, she simply said, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And in those 6 words, she gave him the one thing he'd never had, permission to be broken and loved anyway. The midnight air wrapped around them both, carrying the weight of truth and the first fragile shoots of real intimacy. Elena reached up slowly, telegraphing her movement, and when David didn't flinch away, she wiped a tear from his cheek with infinite gentleness. We don't have to figure everything out tonight, she whispered. But we don't have to figure it out alone, either. For the first time in 15 years, David Chen allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worth saving. The moment Elena's fingertips touched his cheek, David jerked back as if she'd burned him. The spell of midnight confession shattered like glass, and suddenly he was on his feet, putting the width of the balcony between them. No, he said, his voice harsh with panic. No, you can't, this isn't how this works, Elena. She stood frozen where he'd left her, her hand still extended in the space where his face had been. The tenderness in her eyes shifted to confusion, then hurt, then something that looked dangerously like determination. "How what works?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. David ran his hands through his hair, pacing the small confines of the balcony like a caged animal. "This. You can't just accept it and think that makes it okay. You have no idea what you're saying yes to." "Then tell me." Elena wrapped her arms around herself against the night chill, but she didn't retreat back inside. "Make me understand." "Understand what?" David's laugh was bitter, self-deprecating. "That your husband is a fucking mess? That I haven't had a normal relationship with intimacy since I was 15? That some nights I wake up screaming from nightmares I can't even remember?" Each word felt like he was ripping it from his chest, but he couldn't stop. Better to hurt her now with the truth than destroy her slowly with the reality of what marriage to him would actually mean. "That I've been in therapy for 8 years and I still can't. I can't be touched sometimes without feeling like I'm going to crawl out of my skin. That I lied to you every time you asked why I wanted to take things slow, why I never stayed the night." Elena's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. "You never lied to me. You said you wanted to wait until marriage because it would be special." "Because I was terrified." The words exploded out of him. "Because I thought maybe if I had a ring on my finger and vows between us, I could pretend to be normal long enough to fake my way through it. But I can't, Elena. Standing there tonight, watching you look at me like I was some kind of hero, knowing what you were expecting." He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to block out the memory of her face during their first dance, so full of love and trust and anticipation for what their wedding night would bring. "I would have ruined it," he whispered. "I would have ruined everything beautiful about you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, and when David finally looked at her, her expression was unreadable. Then she said, "Do you think I'm that fragile?" The question caught him off guard. "What? Do you think I'm so fragile that knowing the man I love survived trauma would break me? That loving someone with scars would somehow contaminate me?" David stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "Because that's what you're really saying," Elena continued, her voice gaining strength. "You're saying that I'm too weak to love all of you. That I'm too shallow to handle anything that isn't perfect and easy." "That's not," David started, but Elena held up her hand. "Isn't it?" Her eyes flashed with something between anger and hurt. "You made a decision about what I could handle without ever giving me the chance to make that choice myself. You decided I was better off abandoned on my wedding night than trusted with the truth about who you really are." The accusation hit him like a physical blow. "I was protecting you." "From what? From loving my husband? From being there for you when you need me most?" Elena stepped closer, and this time David couldn't bring himself to back away. "Or were you protecting yourself from the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could love you exactly as you are?" David's chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. She was too close, and her words were cutting through every defense he'd built over the years. "You don't understand what you're asking for." "Then show me." Elena's voice was fierce, uncompromising. "Stop deciding what I can handle and show me what love looks like when it's real and messy and complicated." "Elena." "No." She shook her head, dark hair whipping around her shoulders. "I spent my entire life feeling like I wasn't enough for anyone. Not pretty enough, not smart enough, not successful enough. Do you know what it felt like when you walked away tonight? It felt like confirmation of every insecurity I've ever had about myself." David's face crumpled. "Elena, no. This isn't about you not being enough. You're everything. You're perfect." "I'm not perfect." The words came out louder than she'd intended, echoing off the buildings around them. "I'm terrified of abandonment because my father left when I was 6. I have anxiety attacks in crowded places. I cry during commercial about dogs finding homes because I'm afraid of being unwanted. I'm not some pristine princess who needs to be protected from real life." David stared at her, seeing perhaps for the first time the woman beneath the image he'd constructed, the one he'd put on such a pedestal that he'd convinced himself he could never be worthy of reaching. "I chose you," Elena said, her voice breaking. "Not some perfect version of you. Not some fantasy. I chose you, David Chen, with all your scars and fears and broken places. Because those are part of you, and I love you." The silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid things. David's hands were shaking at his sides, and Elena could see the war still raging in his eyes. "What if I can't?" he whispered finally. "What if I try and I still can't be a real husband to you? What if therapy and love and all the good intentions in the world aren't enough to fix what's broken in me?" Elena's expression softened, some of the fight going out of her. "Then we figure it out together. Marriage isn't a performance, David. It's a partnership." But David was already shaking his head, stepping back toward the railing. "You say that now, but you don't know. You don't know what it's like to be married to someone who might never be able to give you children because the thought of creating life when you've been touched by something so ugly makes you sick. You don't know what it's like to have a husband who might flinch away from you on your anniversary, or who might have to sleep in another room when the nightmares get bad." Each word was like a nail in the coffin of their marriage, and Elena could see him building the walls back up in real time, brick by brick. "You deserve someone whole," David said, his voice hollow again. "Someone who can give you everything you dreamed about when you were a little girl playing wedding with your dolls." "And what if what I dreamed about was just finding someone who would choose me every day?" Elena shot back. "What if what I wanted was a partner who would trust me enough to let me love him through the hard parts?" David closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were distant. The man who had broken down and let her see his pain was gone, replaced by the controlled, careful version of himself she'd watched him become over the past few hours. "I should go," he said quietly. "I should pack my things and give you space to figure out what you want to do about this." "David, no. I'll sleep at James's tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out the legal stuff. The annulment or whatever." The word annulment hit Elena like a slap. She watched her husband, because he was still her husband, damn it, gather up his tuxedo jacket and move toward the balcony door that led back into their suite. "So that's it," she called after him. "You're just going to run away again." David stopped with his hand on the door handle, his shoulders rigid. "I'm not running away," he said without turning around. "I'm letting you go. Those are the same thing, and you know it." For a moment, Elena thought he might turn around. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand tightened on the door handle. But then he straightened, and when he spoke again, his voice was carefully neutral. "I'll have my lawyers contact yours about dividing the wedding gifts. And the deposits for the honeymoon can be transferred to your name if you want to take your sister or something." The casual practicality of it, the way he was already planning the dissolution of their marriage before it had even really begun, made Elena's chest tight with rage and heartbreak. "You're a coward," she said quietly. David's hand stilled on the door handle. "You survived something terrible, and you still found the courage to fall in love, to propose, to stand in front of everyone we know and promise to be my husband. But now, when it comes to actually trusting me with who you really are, you're a coward." David didn't respond, but Elena could see the rigid line of his back, the way he was holding himself perfectly still. "Fine," she said, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. "Run. But don't pretend you're doing it for me. You're doing it because you're scared, and it's easier to be alone than to risk letting someone love you." David opened the door and stepped into the suite without looking back. Elena stood alone on the balcony, the city lights blurring through her tears, listening to the sounds of her husband gathering his things to leave her for the second time on their wedding night. Inside, David moved through their suite like a ghost, throwing clothes into his overnight bag with mechanical precision. Every item he packed felt like another step away from the life he'd glimpsed on the balcony, the impossible dream of being loved exactly as he was, damage and all. His phone buzzed. A text from his brother James. "Talked to Mom. She said you never came home after the reception. Everything okay?" David stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Can I crash at your place tonight? I'll explain later." The response came immediately, "Always. You know that." David closed his eyes against the sudden rush of gratitude. At least someone still wanted him around. He zipped up his bag and took one last look around the suite. Elena was still on the balcony, her silhouette small and still against the city lights. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to go to her, to try again, to believe that maybe love could be enough. But love hadn't been enough to protect him when he was 15. Love hadn't been enough to erase the nightmares or the panic attacks or the way his skin crawled when he was touched without warning. Love, he'd learned the hard way, was just another word for eventual disappointment. David walked out of room 247 for the second time that night, leaving his wife alone with the ruins of their wedding day and the echo of all the words they should have said years ago. Have you ever been so afraid of being hurt that you hurt someone else first? Sometimes the people we love most are the hardest to trust with our deepest wounds. What do you think Elena should do next? Outside in the hallway, David paused at the elevator, his finger hovering over the call button. Through the door behind him, he could hear Elena crying, soft, broken sounds that tore at what was left of his heart. He pressed the button and waited, telling himself he was doing the right thing. The elevator doors opened, and David stepped inside, watching the numbers count down as he descended away from the only person who had ever made him feel like he might be worth saving. David made it exactly 14 blocks from the hotel before the universe conspired against his retreat. The first drops of rain hit his windshield as he sat at a red light, fat and heavy with the promise of a storm. By the time he reached James's apartment complex, the sky had opened up with the kind of torrential downpour that turned streets into rivers and made visibility nearly impossible. But it wasn't the rain that made him pull over. It was the phone call. Mr. Chen. The voice was professional, calm in the way that immediately set his nerves on edge. This is Dr. Martinez from Mercy General Emergency Department. We have your wife here. David's blood turned to ice. What? What happened? Is she? She's stable, but she was brought in about 20 minutes ago. There was an incident at the Fairmorn Hotel. A balcony collapse on the 4th floor. She's asking for you. The phone slipped from David's numb fingers, clattering onto the floor of his car. The windshield wipers beat a frantic rhythm against the glass, but all David could hear was the thundering of his own heart. Balcony collapse. 4th floor. Their suite was on the 4th floor. The balcony where he'd left her, where she'd been standing when he'd walked away for the second time that night. David's hands shook as he retrieved his phone and called the number back. This is David Chen. My wife, Elena Chen. You said there was an accident. Yes, sir. Can you come in? She's been asking for you, and we need to discuss her condition. David was already making a U-turn, his tires hydroplaning slightly on the slick asphalt. I'm on my way. Is she? Can you tell me if she's? She's conscious and stable, Mr. Chen. That's all I can tell you over the phone. The 20-minute drive back to the hospital felt like 20 hours. David's mind raced through every terrible possibility. Elena trapped under debris, Elena falling, Elena hurt because he'd left her alone on that balcony. The guilt pressed down on him like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. This is your fault, the voice in his head whispered. You left her. You abandoned her when she needed you most, and now she's hurt. David pulled into the hospital parking lot and ran through the rain, his hair plastered to his head, his dress shirt soaked through by the time he reached the emergency room doors. Elena Chen, he gasped to the receptionist, water dripping onto the desk. My wife. She was brought in from the Fairmorn. Room 12, the woman said kindly, clearly used to panicked family members. Down the hall and to your left. David found the room and stopped short in the doorway. Elena was sitting up in the hospital bed, looking small and fragile in the pale green hospital gown. There was a bandage on her forehead and scrapes along her left arm, but she was alive, she was conscious, and when she saw him, her eyes filled with tears. David, she whispered. He was across the room before he realized he'd moved, stopping just short of the bed, his hands reaching for her and then falling away as muscle memory kicked in. But Elena saw the aborted gesture and caught his hand before he could pull it back. I'm okay, she said quickly, her fingers threading through his. I'm okay. David stared down at their joined hands, at the wedding ring still on her finger, and felt something crack open in his chest. What happened? The doctor said balcony collapse. Not our balcony. Elena's grip tightened on his hand. The one below ours. I heard the sound, and I leaned over to look, and part of the railing gave way. I fell about 6 feet onto the 3rd floor balcony. David's legs gave out, and he collapsed into the chair beside her bed. Jesus. Elena. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. Her voice was steady, but David could see the fear lingering in her eyes. Bruised ribs, some scrapes, mild concussion. The doctor says I was lucky. Lucky, David repeated hollowly. He was still staring at their hands, at the way her fingers looked so small and breakable in his. You fell off a balcony. David. Elena's free hand touched his cheek, and this time he didn't pull away. Look at me. He raised his eyes to hers, and the expression on his face made her heart break all over again. Guilt, fear, self-hatred, all of it written plainly across his features. "This wasn't your fault," she said firmly. "I left you alone. If I had stayed. If you had stayed, you might have been standing right there with me when it happened. You might have been hurt too." Elena's voice was fierce, brooking no argument. "This was an accident, David. A freak accident that had nothing to do with you leaving." But David was shaking his head, pulling his hand free from hers to run it through his wet hair. "Everything about tonight has been my fault. The wedding, leaving you alone, and now this. Stop." The sharp command in Elena's voice cut through his spiral of self-blame. "Just stop. You don't get to take responsibility for a balcony railing failing. You don't get to add this to your list of reasons why you're not worthy of love." A knock on the door interrupted them. A doctor with kind eyes and graying temples stepped into the room. "Mr. Chen? I'm Dr. Williams. I've been taking care of your wife." David stood up, immediately falling into the role of concerned husband despite everything. "Is she going to be okay?" "The concussion." "Mild," Dr. Williams assured him. "Her CT scan looks good, but we want to keep her overnight for observation. Concussion protocol. Someone needs to wake her every few hours to check her pupil response and cognitive function." "I can do that," David said immediately. Dr. Williams smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that. There's a fold-out bed in here, and visiting hours are extended for spouses staying overnight with patients." David felt Elena's eyes on him, but he couldn't meet her gaze. Of course he would stay. She was hurt, and regardless of the state of their marriage, he wasn't going to leave her alone in a hospital. "There is one other thing," Dr. Williams continued. "Mrs. Chen mentioned that tonight was your wedding night." Heat flooded David's cheeks. "Yes." The doctor's expression grew sympathetic. "I know this isn't how you planned to spend it. The nursing staff has arranged for you to have some privacy, and will try to keep interruptions to a minimum between the neurological checks." David almost laughed at the irony. Their wedding night, spent in a hospital room with Elena concussed and David sleeping in a fold-out chair. It was like the universe's idea of a cruel joke. "Thank you," Elena said when David remained silent. After Dr. Williams left, they sat in uncomfortable silence. The storm outside had intensified, lightning flashing beyond the small window, thunder rolling across the sky. The hospital room felt like a bubble, separate from the rest of the world. "You don't have to stay," Elena said finally. David looked at her incredulously. "You have a concussion. You're in the hospital. Of course I'm staying. Even though 12 hours ago you were ready to file for an annulment." The question hung between them, sharp and painful. David stared down at his hands that were still shaking slightly from the adrenaline crash of thinking he'd lost her. "That's different," he said quietly. "How?" "Because." David struggled to find the words. "Because you're hurt. Because I'm your husband, whether or not I'm good at it. Because the thought of you being alone and scared in a hospital room makes me want to punch something." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "The thought of you being alone and scared makes me want to fight for you." David's chest tightened. "Elena. I know you're afraid," she continued. "I know tonight didn't go the way either of us planned. But I also know that when you thought I was seriously hurt, you drove through a storm to get to me. That has to mean something." David closed his eyes. "It means I care about you. It doesn't mean I'm capable of being what you need." "What I need," Elena said firmly, "is honesty. What I need is for my husband to trust me enough to let me decide what I can handle." Thunder crashed outside, close enough to rattle the windows. The lights flickered, and in the brief darkness, David saw Elena flinch slightly. "Hey," he said, his voice gentling automatically. "It's just the storm." "I know." But Elena's hand was gripping the bed rail, her knuckles white. Falling earlier, and now the thunder. I feel a little jumpy." Without thinking, David reached out and covered her hand with his. Elena's eyes widened in surprise, but she didn't pull away. "Better?" he asked softly. Elena nodded, her fingers relaxing under his touch. "Better." They stayed like that for a while, listening to the storm rage outside their small sanctuary. David found himself studying Elena's face in the soft lighting, the bruise forming on her cheek, the way her dark hair spread across the white pillowcase, the determined set of her jaw even in sleep. She could have died tonight. The thought kept circling back, making his chest tight with terror and something else, something that felt dangerously like gratitude. Grateful that she was alive, that she was here, that despite everything he'd put her through, she was still wearing his ring. David. Elena's voice was drowsy, the pain medication and concussion making her sleepy. Yeah. When I was falling, you know what I thought about. David's hand tightened on hers. What? I thought about how I was going to die on my wedding night without ever really being your wife. Elena's eyes were closed, but tears leaked from the corners. And I thought about how you were going to blame yourself, and how that would destroy you. David's breath caught in his throat. Elena. I don't want to die without knowing what it feels like to really be married to you, she whispered. The real you. Scars and all. The words hit David like lightning, illuminating all the dark corners of his heart he'd been hiding from. She could have died tonight, and she'd spent those terrifying moments thinking about him, worrying about how her death would affect him. I'm scared, he admitted, the words barely audible. I know. Elena's thumb brushed across his knuckles. I'm scared too. But maybe we can be scared together. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small room, something fragile and precious was taking root. David didn't pull his hand away when Elena's breathing evened out in sleep. Instead, he settled into the uncomfortable chair beside her bed and prepared to keep watch through the night. Every hour, when the nurse came to check Elena's pupils and ask her basic questions, David was there. When Elena woke confused and frightened from the concussion, not remembering where she was, David's voice was the one that grounded her. You're safe, he told her each time. I'm here. You're safe. And somewhere in the long hours before dawn, as he watched over his sleeping wife, David began to understand that maybe safety wasn't about being perfect or unbroken. Maybe it was about being willing to stay. What does it mean to truly show up for someone you love? Sometimes the most profound moments happen not in perfect settings, but in hospital rooms and storms. Have you ever had to choose between fear and love? As the storm outside began to quiet and the first hints of dawn touched the horizon, David Chen made a decision that would change everything. He was done running. The morning light filtering through the hospital room window found David exactly where he'd been all night, in the chair beside Elena's bed, her hand still clasped loosely in his. He dozed fitfully between the hourly neurological checks, but mostly he just watched her sleep, cataloguing every breath, every flutter of her eyelashes, as if he could keep her safe through sheer vigilance. Elena stirred as the day shift nurse finished checking her vitals, her dark eyes focusing on David with more clarity than she'd shown since the accident. You stayed, she said softly, her voice hoarse from sleep. Where else would I be? David's thumb brushed across her knuckles, the gesture becoming more natural each time he did it. I don't know. Filing annulment papers. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a quiet honesty that made David's chest ache. Before he could respond, Dr. Williams appeared in the doorway. Good morning, Mrs. Chen. How are you feeling? Like I fell off a building, Elena said wryly, carefully pushing herself up to sitting. David immediately moved to help her, his hands gentle but sure as he adjusted her pillows. Technically, it was only 6 feet, Dr. Williams smiled as he checked her pupils with his penlight. Follow my finger. Good. Any nausea? Dizziness? A little dizzy when I sit up too fast, but better than last night. Excellent. I think we can discharge you this afternoon, but you'll need someone to keep an eye on you for the next 24 hours. Concussion symptoms can be unpredictable. David nodded immediately. I'll make sure she rests. After the doctor left, silence settled over them again. Elena studied David's face, taking in the exhaustion around his eyes, the stubble shadowing his jaw, the way his expensive dress shirt was wrinkled from sleeping in a chair. You look terrible, she said gently. David huffed out a laugh. Thanks. You look like you fell off a balcony. Touché. Elena shifted carefully, wincing as her bruised ribs protested. David, about last night. Don't. David's voice was quiet but firm. Don't apologize for anything. I'm the one who should be. I wasn't going to apologize. Elena's interruption caught him off guard. I was going to say that I meant every word I said on that balcony. Even the part about you being a coward. David winced. Elena. But I also understand now why you were so scared. Elena's voice grew softer. Sitting here all night, watching you take care of me even when you were terrified and exhausted. I kept thinking about what it must have been like for you. Being 15 and having someone who was supposed to protect you hurt you instead. David went very still, his hand tightening on hers. I kept thinking about how brave you had to be just to let me into your life at all. How much courage it must have taken to fall in love when every instinct you had was probably telling you to run. It wasn't courage, David said hoarsely. It was selfishness. I wanted you so much I convinced myself I could fake being normal. Tell me about him, Elena said quietly. Your father. David's entire body tensed, and for a moment Elena thought he might pull away, retreat behind the walls he'd built so carefully over the years. But then he took a shaky breath and began to speak. He wasn't always. He was a good father when I was little. I have memories of him teaching me to ride a bike, helping me with math homework, taking me to baseball games. David's voice was distant, like he was reading from someone else's story. But he was also an alcoholic. A functional one, mostly. He held down his job at the accounting firm, never missed work, never got arrested. Elena remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might stop him from talking. My mother traveled a lot for work back then. She was a pharmaceutical sales rep, gone 3 or 4 days a week. And when she was gone, David's voice trailed off, and he stared at their joined hands. When I was about 14, he started coming to my room after he'd been drinking. At first it was just touching over my clothes. He'd tell me it was normal, that fathers and sons in close families did this. That it was our secret because other people wouldn't understand. Elena's free hand clenched into a fist, but she kept her voice steady. How long did it go on? About 1.5 years. It got worse over time. More invasive. David's voice was clinical now, detached, as if he was describing something that had happened to someone else. He'd tell me I was special, that I was more mature than other boys my age, that this was how he was showing me love. David, Elena whispered, her heart breaking for the boy he'd been. The worst part wasn't even what he did, David continued, his voice barely audible. It was that sometimes my body responded. And he'd use that as proof that I wanted it, that I was asking for it. I spent years convinced that I was gay, that I was somehow complicit in what happened. Elena's tears were flowing freely now, but she kept her voice steady. You know that's not true, right? What your body did was biology. It had nothing to do with what you wanted. David nodded jerkily. I know that now. Dr. Williams, my therapist, not the hospital doctor, she's helped me understand that. But knowing something intellectually and believing it emotionally are two different things. What happened when it stopped? He had a heart attack when I was 16. Massive coronary at his office. He was dead before the paramedics got there. David's voice was flat, empty. I remember standing at his funeral, listening to people talk about what a good man he was, what a devoted father, and wanting to scream the truth at all of them. Elena squeezed his hand. Did you ever tell anyone? I told my mother about 6 months after he died. She. David's voice cracked slightly. She didn't believe me at first. Said I was having grief hallucinations or something. When I finally convinced her I was telling the truth, she fell apart. Blamed herself for traveling so much, for not seeing the signs. That must have been incredibly isolating. It was. She started drinking heavily, ended up in rehab twice. I essentially became an adult at 16, managing the house, making sure bills got paid, taking care of her when she was too drunk or depressed to function. David looked up at Elena, his eyes haunted. Do you see now why I can't be what you need? I've been taking care of broken people my whole life. I don't know how to be the one who gets taken care of. Elena was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he'd shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm. Can I tell you something about the night we met? David looked confused by the apparent non sequitur, but nodded. It was at Sarah's birthday party, remember? You were standing by yourself near the kitchen, and I spent about 20 minutes working up the courage to talk to you. You did not, David said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. You walked right up to me and started a conversation about the terrible music. After 20 minutes of internal pep talks, Elena laughed softly. Do you want to know what I was thinking about during those 20 minutes? David waited. I was thinking about how you looked safe. There were plenty of more conventionally attractive men at that party, guys who are louder and more charming and more obviously confident. But there was something about you that made me feel calm. Protected, even though we hadn't spoken a word. Elena shifted carefully in the bed, turning to face him more fully. You want to know what I saw when I looked at you? I saw someone who understood what it was like to be careful with fragile things. Someone who knew how to be gentle because you'd needed gentleness yourself. David's breath caught. Elena. I fell in love with your careful hands, she continued. The way you always asked before you touched me, even to hold my hand. The way you listened, really listened, when I talked about my anxiety, my fear of abandonment. You never tried to fix me or tell me my feelings were silly. You just made space for them. Tears were tracking down David's cheeks now, but he didn't try to hide them. So when you tell me that your trauma makes you broken, that it makes you unable to be what I need, you're wrong. Elena's voice was fierce with conviction. Your trauma made you exactly the man I needed. Someone who understands that healing happens slowly, that love requires patience, that the most beautiful things are often the ones that have been carefully mended. David stared at her, something shifting in his chest, a loosening of a knot he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. I used to cut myself, Elena said quietly. The admission hung between them, simple and devastating. David's eyes widened. What? In high school, after my father left, I felt so angry and hurt and helpless, and cutting it was the only way I could feel like I had control over my pain. Elena pulled back the sleeve of her hospital gown, revealing thin white scars along her forearm that David had noticed before but never asked about. I told you they were from a car accident when we first started dating, she continued. Because I was ashamed. Because I thought if you knew the truth about how broken I was, you'd leave. David reached out tentatively, his fingertips ghosting over the scars with infinite gentleness. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want you to understand that we're both carrying wounds, David. We're both scared of not being enough, of being too damaged to deserve love. But maybe that's exactly why we found each other. David looked down at Elena's scars, then up at her face, bruised but beautiful, vulnerable but strong, and felt something crack open inside his chest. I don't know how to not be afraid, he whispered. Neither do I, Elena replied. But maybe we can learn together. Outside their window, the world was waking up to a new day. Somewhere in the city, other couples were probably sharing lazy Sunday morning breakfasts, reading newspapers in bed, planning their futures. But in this small hospital room, two wounded souls were finally learning what it meant to be truly seen. David lifted Elena's hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her palm, the first purely affectionate touch he'd initiated since their wedding night began. I love you, he said simply. I love you, and I'm terrified, and I don't know how to do this, but I want to try. Elena smiled, the first real smile she'd given him since before the wedding ceremony. I love you too, she said. And I think trying is enough for now. Have you ever had to choose between the fear of vulnerability and the possibility of true connection? Sometimes our deepest wounds become the very things that allow us to love others more fully. What scars have taught you how to be gentle? The morning sun climbed higher outside their window, and David Chen began to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing was possible after all. The afternoon discharge process took longer than expected, giving David and Elena hours of uninterrupted time together in their small sanctuary. The hospital room, which had felt sterile and cold the night before, now seemed intimate, a place where they could speak freely without the weight of wedding expectations or the ghosts of their respective pasts looming quite so large. Elena was sitting cross-legged on the bed, having changed into the clothes David had retrieved from their hotel suite, soft leggings and one of his Columbia sweatshirts that hung loose on her smaller frame. The sight of her in his clothes did something to David's chest, something warm and possessive and tender all at once. Tell me about Dr. Williams, Elena said, carefully working through a cup of the hospital's terrible coffee. Your therapist, I mean. David was sprawled in the visitor's chair, his long legs stretched out in front of him. He'd managed a few hours of real sleep after their morning conversation, and though he looked exhausted, some of the tension had left his shoulders. I started seeing her in college, he said. After I had a panic attack during a psychology class about trauma responses. Very ironic, actually. Elena smiled softly. What's she like? Relentless, David said, but there was affection in his voice. She doesn't let me get away with anything. When I told her I was getting married, she asked me if Elena knew about my father. What did you tell her? That I was going to tell you. Eventually. David ran a hand through his hair. She said that secrets in marriage were like cracks in a foundation. They might hold for a while, but eventually the whole structure would collapse. Smart woman. Yeah, well, she was right. I just didn't expect the collapse to happen on our wedding night. David's voice held a note of dark humor. Elena set down her coffee and studied his face. Can I ask you something? And you can say no if it's too much. David nodded. Last night, when you were talking about not being able to give me children, is that something you've thought about a lot? David's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't look away. Yeah. I mean, logically I know that what happened to me doesn't mean I would ever hurt a child. But the thought of being responsible for creating life when I was touched by something so... He struggled for the words. It feels like tempting fate, I guess. Elena was quiet for a moment, processing. Have you talked to Dr. Williams about it? Ad nauseam. She thinks it's more about my fear of passing on damage than any real concern about being a bad father. David's smile was rueful. She's probably right. She usually is. What do you think? David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city beyond. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I think I spent so many years convinced that what happened to me was my fault that I can't quite believe I wouldn't somehow contaminate any child I helped create. Even though I know, intellectually, that trauma isn't contagious. Elena slid to the edge of the bed, her feet dangling over the side. Can I tell you something? Always. When I was in high school, cutting myself, I used to fantasize about having children someday. Not because I wanted to be a mother, exactly, but because I wanted to prove to myself that I could love someone purely. That I could protect someone the way I'd needed to be protected. David looked at her with surprise. Really? Really? I thought that if I could raise a child who never felt unwanted or abandoned or like they had to hurt themselves to feel in control, then maybe I wasn't as broken as I thought. Elena's smile was sad. It took me years to realize that healing myself had to come first. That I couldn't save a child from wounds I hadn't learned to tend in myself. And now? Now I think maybe the point isn't to create perfect children or to prove we're healed. Maybe the point is to love someone, child or partner or friend, with full knowledge of our own broken places. To be honest about our scars while still choosing to be tender. David stared at her, something shifting in his expression. How did you get so wise? Therapy, Elena laughed. Lots and lots of therapy. And books. So many self-help books that my sister started staging interventions. The mention of family made David think of something. Speaking of Carmen, she's been texting you. And calling. I saw your phone lighting up earlier. Elena's face fell slightly. I should probably... People are going to want explanations. About why we disappeared from our own reception, why I'm in the hospital. What do you want to tell them? The question was simple, but Elena recognized the weight behind it. What story did they want to write about this night? How did they want their marriage to begin in the eyes of the world? I want to tell them that we had some things to work through, and that we're working through them, Elena said finally. I want to tell them that love is messier than wedding vows make it sound, but that we're choosing each other anyway. David felt something ease in his chest. Even after everything? Even knowing what you know now? Especially because of everything. Elena's voice was firm. David, look at me. He did, and the expression on her face took his breath away. There was no pity there, no careful handling of his fragile psyche. There was just love, clear-eyed, unwavering, real. I'm not going anywhere, she said simply. Whatever this looks like, whatever we need to figure out, I'm not going anywhere. David's throat worked, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I don't know how to be a husband, Elena. I don't know how to share a bed with someone or talk about my day or fight about money or any of the normal married people things. Good thing I don't know how to be a wife, Elena said with a smile. We can figure it out together. A comfortable silence fell between them. David found himself really looking at Elena, not the idealized version he created in his mind, but the real woman sitting in front of him. Her hair was messy, there was a bruise on her cheek, and she was wearing his sweatshirt inside out. She'd survived a balcony collapse on their wedding night and spent the morning talking him through the worst parts of his trauma. She was nothing like the fragile princess he'd convinced himself she was. She was so much better. She was real. Elena. Yeah. When we get out of here, when we go home, I want to try something. What? David took a deep breath. I want to try sleeping in the same bed. Not doing anything, just sleeping. Together. Like married people do. Elena's face lit up. Are you sure? No, David said honestly. I'm not sure about anything. But I want to try. With you. Okay. Elena's smile was radiant. We can try. I might have nightmares, David warned. I might wake up disoriented or scared. I might need to sleep in the guest room sometimes. Then we'll figure that out too. David stood up and moved to sit on the edge of the bed beside her, close enough that their knees touched. Elena didn't move away, and David found that her proximity didn't make his skin crawl the way it had with other people. Can I try something else? He asked quietly. Elena nodded. David reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and cupped her face in his palm. His thumb brushed gently over the bruise on her cheek, and Elena leaned into the touch. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry I left you alone. I'm sorry it took you getting hurt for me to realize that running away wasn't protecting either of us. David. Let me finish. His voice was soft but determined. I'm sorry I spent so much time convincing myself you couldn't handle the truth that I never gave you the chance to prove me wrong. You're the strongest person I know, and I should have trusted that strength from the beginning. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. Thank you. For what? For coming back. For staying. For trusting me with your story. Elena covered his hand with hers, pressing his palm more firmly against her cheek. For letting me love you exactly as you are. David leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. It was intimate without being sexual, tender without being fragile. I love you too, he whispered. All of you. The parts that hurt and the parts that heal and the parts that are still figuring out which is which. They stayed like that for a long time, foreheads touching, hands intertwined, breathing each other in. Outside their window, the city hummed with Sunday afternoon life, but inside their small room, time seemed suspended. David. When we get home, will you show me your wedding ring? David pulled back to look at her, confused. What do you mean? Elena smiled, a little embarrassed. You never put it on. During the ceremony, I put yours on your finger, but you were shaking so hard. You couldn't get mine on right, and then you forgot to put yours on. David looked down at his left hand, still bare, still unmarked. He'd been so focused on his panic, on his certainty that he was making a mistake, that he hadn't completed that simple, symbolic act. I'd like to try again, Elena continued. Not the whole ceremony. Just the rings. In our living room. Just us. A promise to start over, to try again, to be honest this time. David's throat tightened with emotion. You still want to be married to me? David Chen, Elena said, her voice soft but fierce. I have never wanted anything more in my life. David kissed her then, soft, chaste, but full of promise. It was their second kiss as husband and wife, but it felt like the first real one. When they broke apart, David was smiling, the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him since before their wedding ceremony. Mrs. Chen, he said, testing out the name. Mr. Chen, Elena replied, grinning back at him. I like the sound of that. Me too. A knock on the door interrupted them, and Dr. Williams entered with Elena's discharge papers. Well, you two look much better than you did this morning, he observed with a smile. We feel better, Elena said, her hand still clasped in David's. Good. Now, Mrs. Chen, remember what I said about taking it easy for the next few days. Light activity only, and if you experience any worsening headaches, vision changes, or persistent nausea, come back immediately. She'll rest, David said firmly. I'll make sure of it. Dr. Williams looked between them, noting the way they sat close together now, the way David's thumb was stroking gentle circles on Elena's hand. Marriage is a beautiful thing, he said quietly. But it's also hard work. The couples who make it are the ones who choose each other every day, especially on the days when choosing is difficult. David and Elena exchanged a look, understanding passing between them. We're learning that, Elena said softly. Good. Take care of each other. After he left, David and Elena gathered their things in comfortable companionship. David helped Elena into her jacket, his movements careful and attentive. Elena watched him in the small mirror on the hospital room wall, seeing not the distant, panicked man from their wedding night, but her husband, scarred, imperfect, and absolutely hers. Ready to go home, Mrs. Chen? David asked, offering her his arm. Elena smiled and took it. Ready, Mr. Chen. What does it mean to choose someone not despite their wounds, but because of how those wounds have shaped their capacity for love? Sometimes the most profound healing happens not in isolation, but in the sacred space between two people brave enough to be fully seen. As they walked out of Mercy General together, Elena's hand tucked securely into the crook of David's arm, neither of them looked back. They were too busy looking forward, toward home, toward the marriage they were finally ready to begin. 3 days later, Elena woke up alone. She reached across the bed instinctively, her hand finding only cold sheets where David should have been. They'd spent the previous 2 nights learning to sleep beside each other, a careful dance of boundaries and small intimacies. David on his side of the bed, Elena on hers, but their hands finding each other in the dark, fingers intertwined like anchors. It had been working. They'd been working. Elena sat up carefully, her ribs still tender from the fall, and listened to the sounds of their apartment. The coffee maker was running, David's morning ritual, but something felt off. The silence was too heavy, too loaded with tension. She found him in the kitchen, fully dressed despite it being only 6 in the morning, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he wasn't drinking. His overnight bag sat by the door like an accusation. David. Elena's voice was small in the pre-dawn quiet. What's happening? He looked up at her, and the expression on his face made her blood run cold. The man who had held her hand through neurological checks, who had kissed her forehead and whispered reassurances in the hospital, was gone. In his place was the distant, carefully controlled version of himself she'd hoped never to see again. I can't do this, he said quietly. Elena felt the words like a physical blow. Can't do what? This. Us. Marriage. David's voice was clinical, detached. I thought after the hospital, after our conversation, I thought maybe I could learn to be normal. But I can't, Elena. I tried, and I can't. Elena moved closer, noting how he tensed as she approached. What happened? Last night we were fine. You held my hand when I had that nightmare about falling. That's exactly the problem, David interrupted, his jaw tight. You had a nightmare, and instead of being able to comfort you properly, I just laid there, frozen. My own wife was scared and hurting, and I couldn't even hold you because the thought of having someone pressed against me in bed made my skin crawl. Elena's heart clenched. She remembered the moment, waking up gasping from dreams of falling balconies, reaching for David, feeling him go rigid beside her even as his fingers tightened on hers. David, that doesn't matter. It matters to me. The words exploded out of him, raw and anguished. It matters that 3 days into our marriage, I can't comfort my own wife. It matters that I flinch when you touch me without warning. It matters that last night when you rolled over in your sleep and your arm brushed against my chest, I had to go to the bathroom and have a panic attack. Elena's face crumpled. You had a panic attack? Why didn't you wake me? Because what was the point? David's laugh was bitter. So you could feel guilty for touching your own husband? So you could add can't cuddle to the list of ways I'm failing you? You're not failing me. I am. David slammed his coffee mug down on the counter, the sound sharp and violent in the quiet kitchen. I'm failing you every minute of every day. Do you know what I did yesterday when you were napping? I researched annulment lawyers, Elena. I spent 2 hours reading about grounds for dissolution of marriage. The admission hit Elena like a slap. She stepped back, wrapping her arms around herself. I see, she said quietly. No, you don't see. You want to see the best in me, want to believe that love conquers all, but that's not how trauma works. That's not how this works. David began pacing, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Dr. Williams warned me this might happen. She said that sometimes when trauma survivors try to move too fast, their psyche rebels. Tries to protect them by shutting down. So we slow down. We've been together for 2 years, Elena. How much slower can we go? David's voice was rising, tinged with desperation. Most couples our age are talking about having children. We can't even sleep in the same bed without me having a breakdown. Elena felt tears starting to burn behind her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. Since when do we care what other couples are doing? Since I realized that I'm never going to be able to give you the marriage you deserve. David stopped pacing and looked at her directly. You want to know what happened last night that really broke me? It wasn't the panic attack. It was after, when I was sitting in the bathroom, shaking and trying to breathe. Elena waited, dreading what was coming. I heard you crying, David said quietly. Soft, quiet little sobs because you thought I couldn't hear. And I realized that 3 days in, I was already making you cry. I was already causing you pain just by being your husband. David, that's not. I called my mother this morning, David continued, as if she hadn't spoken. Told her about the hospital, about our conversation. You know what she said. Elena shook her head, though she suspected she didn't want to know. She said she thought maybe I'd been selfish, getting married. That maybe I should have dealt with my issues before dragging someone else into them. David's voice broke slightly. She said she loved you too much to watch me destroy you the way my father destroyed both of us. The words hung in the air like poison, and Elena felt something crack inside her chest. So that's it? Your mother disapproves, and you're ready to give up. It's not about my mother. Isn't it? Elena's voice was gaining strength, fueled by hurt and growing anger. Yesterday you were willing to try. Yesterday you were talking about putting your wedding ring on, about starting over. What changed? David closed his eyes. I got a call from Dr. Williams. Elena went very still. What kind of call? She wanted to check in, see how I was adjusting to married life. I told her about the hospital, about our conversations, about how hopeful I was feeling. David's laugh was hollow. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said something that made me realize how delusional I've been. What did she say? She asked me if I was doing better, or if I was just high on the relief of not having to hide anymore. David met Elena's eyes, and the pain there was devastating. She said sometimes confession feels like healing, but it's not the same thing. That I might be mistaking emotional intimacy for recovery. Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. And you believed her. She's been right about everything else, David said defensively. When she told me I wasn't ready for marriage, when she said I should tell you about my father before the wedding, when she warned me that trauma doesn't disappear just because you fall in love. So you're choosing your therapist's opinion over your wife's. The question was sharp, cutting, and David flinched as if she'd struck him. I'm choosing reality over fantasy, he said. The reality is that I'm a damaged person who can't give you a normal marriage. The reality is that love isn't enough to fix what's broken in me. Elena stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was deadly calm. Do you know what's really broken, David? It's not your trauma. It's your complete inability to believe that anyone could love you exactly as you are. David's face went pale. You're so convinced that you're unlovable that you're sabotaging the one relationship where you don't have to earn acceptance. Elena's voice was gaining strength, fierce with frustrated love. I've spent 3 days showing you that I'm not going anywhere, that I can handle your nightmares and your panic attacks and your need to sleep with the light on. But none of that matters because you've already decided I'm lying. That's not. Yes, it is. Elena stepped closer, her eyes blazing. You're not protecting me, David. You're protecting yourself. Because if you really let me love you, if you really believed I could handle all of you, then you'd have to believe you're worth loving. And that's too scary for you. David's hands were shaking now, his carefully constructed defenses crumbling under the weight of her words. You think I don't know what I'm choosing? Elena continued, relentless. You think I'm some naive little girl who doesn't understand what marriage to you would really look like? I've done the research too, David. I've read about secondary trauma, about the challenges of being married to a survivor. I know it's going to be hard. Then why? Because I love you. The words exploded out of her, raw and desperate. Because hard doesn't mean impossible. Because I would rather spend my life learning how to love you well than spend it without you at all. David was crying now, tears streaming down his face as years of self-hatred warred with a desperate hope her words kindled in his chest. But what if it's never enough? He whispered. What if I can't get better? What if this is as good as it gets? Elena's expression softened, some of the fight going out of her. Then this is enough. You are enough. Exactly as you are, right now, this is enough for me. For a moment, David looked like he might believe her. His hand lifted toward her face, hope flickering in his eyes. But then his gaze fell on his packed bag, and the walls slammed back up. I can't, he said, his voice hollow. I can't risk it. I can't risk hurting you worse than I already have. The only way you're going to hurt me is by leaving, Elena said desperately. David, please. Don't do this. Don't make this choice for both of us. But David was already reaching for his bag, his movements mechanical, determined. I'm going to stay at James's for a while. Give you space to think about what you really want. I know what I want. Elena's voice cracked. I want my husband. David paused at the door, his hand on the handle. I'll call you in a few days. When you've had time to think clearly. If you walk out that door, David Chen, I will never forgive you. The words were meant to stop him, but they had the opposite effect. David's shoulders straightened, and when he turned back to look at her, his face was resigned. Good, he said quietly. That'll make the annulment easier. And then he was gone, leaving Elena alone in their kitchen with the smell of coffee growing cold and the sound of her heart breaking all over again. She sank to the floor right where she stood, still wearing the nightgown she'd slept in, and sobbed until she had nothing left. Outside, the city was waking up to another day, but inside their apartment, her apartment now, Elena Chen faced the devastating possibility that love might not be enough after all. Have you ever been so afraid of being hurt that you pushed away the very person trying to love you? Sometimes our greatest enemy isn't the trauma itself, but our belief that we don't deserve healing. What happens when fear wins over love? The morning light streamed through the kitchen windows, illuminating the space where just hours before, two people had been learning to choose each other. Now there was only silence, and the terrible weight of words that couldn't be taken back. 5 days. Elena had been counting them like a prisoner marking time on a cell wall. 5 days since David had walked out of their apartment with his overnight bag and the conviction that he was saving her from himself. 5 days of sleeping alone in a bed that still smelled like him, of making coffee for one, of answering concerned calls from family and friends with carefully crafted half-truths. We're just taking some time to adjust, she told Carmen. You know how overwhelming marriage can be. But the truth was messier, more devastating than anything she could explain to her sister. The truth was that she'd spent 5 days alternating between rage and heartbreak, between wanting to drive to James's apartment and drag David home, and wanting to pack up his belongings and leave them on the sidewalk. Now, sitting in Dr. Sarah Martinez's office, yes, she'd finally called the therapist David had recommended months ago, Elena was trying to make sense of the wreckage of her 3-day marriage. Tell me about the morning he left, Dr. Martinez said gently. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the sort of steady presence that made confession feel safe. He was different, Elena said, twisting her wedding ring around her finger, a gesture that had become compulsive over the past 5 days. Not just distant, but hardened. Like he'd made a decision and nothing I said was going to change his mind. What do you think changed between the hospital and that morning? Elena was quiet for a long moment, thinking back to those 2 precious days when it had felt like they were finally building something real together. Fear, she said finally. I think the intimacy scared him more than the trauma ever did. The trauma he's lived with for years, he knows how to manage it, how to build walls around it. But being truly seen, truly known, that was new territory. Dr. Martinez nodded. Trauma survivors often find emotional intimacy more threatening than the original trauma. The trauma happened to them, but intimacy requires active participation. It requires choice. So he chose to run. He chose what felt safer. But that doesn't mean it was the right choice, or that it's permanent. Elena looked up hopefully. Do you think there's still a chance? I think, Dr. Martinez said carefully, that depends on what you're willing to fight for, and how. Meanwhile, across town, David was having his own reckoning. He'd been staying in James's guest room for 5 days, existing on takeout and guilt, avoiding his brother's increasingly pointed questions about when he planned to go home to his wife. James had been patient at first, but this morning over breakfast, his patience had finally run out. This is bullshit, David, and you know it, James said, slamming his coffee mug down hard enough to make David flinch. You married the love of your life 4 days ago, and now you're hiding out in my spare room like a teenager who got caught sneaking out. You don't understand. I understand that you're scared, James interrupted. I understand that what Dad did to you fucked with your head in ways that are still affecting you 20 years later. But I also understand that Elena loves you, and you love her, and instead of fighting for that, you're running away. David stared down at his untouched eggs, his stomach churning with anxiety and guilt. I'm protecting her. From what? From being married to someone who has bad days? From having to learn patience and communication? Jesus, David, welcome to every marriage ever. It's not the same thing. Isn't it? James leaned forward, his expression intense. You think other couples don't have to work through shit? You think Anna and I don't have nights where one of us is triggered by something, or days where we can barely stand to be in the same room? David looked up, surprised. James and Anna had always seemed so effortlessly happy. Anna has PTSD from a car accident she was in before we met, James continued. Some nights she wakes up screaming. Some days she can't drive, can't even be a passenger without having panic attacks. You think that was easy for me to learn how to navigate? You think there weren't times I wondered if I was strong enough to be what she needed? But you stayed, David said quietly. I stayed because I love her. Because she's worth the hard work. Because the alternative, a life without her, was unthinkable. James reached across the table and gripped David's shoulder. The way a life without Elena should be unthinkable for you. David closed his eyes, and immediately Elena's face filled his mind. Elena in the hospital, bruised but fierce, telling him she wasn't going anywhere. Elena in their kitchen, eyes blazing as she called him out on his fear. Elena crying quietly in the dark, thinking he couldn't hear. What if I can't get better? David whispered. What if this is as good as it gets? Then you get better together, James said simply. That's what marriage is, David. It's not finding someone perfect. It's finding someone worth growing with. 2 hours later, David found himself sitting in the parking lot outside Dr. Williams' office, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he tried to work up the courage to go inside. He'd made the appointment impulsively after his conversation with James, but now he was second-guessing himself. What if Dr. Williams agreed with his decision to leave? What if she confirmed that he wasn't ready for marriage, that he'd been fooling himself about his capacity for a healthy relationship? But what if she didn't? David's phone buzzed. A text from Elena, the first she'd sent since he'd left. I love you. That's not going to change, no matter how scared you are. But I can't fight for us alone. The words hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't asking him to be perfect. She wasn't demanding that he magically heal overnight. She was just asking him to fight alongside her. David got out of the car. You look like hell, Dr. Williams observed when he settled into his usual chair 20 minutes later. Thanks, David said dryly. Really what I needed to hear right now. Good. Because what you need to hear and what you want to hear are two very different things right now. Dr. Williams leaned back in her chair, studying him with the sort of penetrating gaze that had always made David feel like she could see straight through his defenses. Tell me about the phone call, she said. David blinked. What phone call? The one where I supposedly told you that confession isn't the same as healing. The one that convinced you to leave your wife. Heat flooded David's cheeks. You did say that. I said that emotional intimacy can sometimes feel like healing when it's really just relief. I didn't tell you to run away from it. Dr. Williams' voice was firm. In fact, I seem to remember ending that conversation by encouraging you to lean into the discomfort, to see if you could build something real with Elena now that you've been honest with her. David stared at her, his carefully constructed justification crumbling. But you said. I said what I always say. That healing is hard work, that setbacks are normal, that trauma recovery isn't linear. Dr. Williams leaned forward. What I didn't say was that you should abandon the best thing in your life because it scared you. The words hit David like cold water. He'd been so desperate for an excuse to run that he'd twisted Dr. Williams' guidance into permission to flee. She loves me, he said quietly, as if testing the words. She does. The question is, what are you going to do about that? David was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the city beyond. Somewhere out there, Elena was probably at work, trying to pretend her world hadn't shattered 5 days ago. Somewhere out there was the life he'd been too afraid to claim. I don't know how to be married, he finally said. Nobody does. At first. It's not instinctual. David. It's learned behavior. The good news is that you're married to someone who doesn't know how to be married either. You can figure it out together. What if I hurt her? You already have hurt her. You hurt her when you left. The question is, are you going to keep hurting her by staying away, or are you going to hurt her the way people in love sometimes hurt each other, accidentally, and then make it right? David closed his eyes, thinking about Elena's face that last morning. The way she'd looked at him like he was breaking her heart all over again. The way she'd called him a coward. She'd been right. I need to go home, he said quietly. Yes, Dr. Williams agreed. You do. That evening, Elena was sitting on the couch in their living room. She'd finally stopped thinking of it as her apartment, when she heard David's key in the lock. She'd been expecting this moment for 5 days, had imagined it a dozen different ways, but now that it was happening, she felt paralyzed. The door opened slowly, and David stepped inside like he was entering a minefield. He looked terrible, exhausted, unshaven, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when he left. His overnight bag was in one hand, his wedding ring in the other. They stared at each other across the room, 5 days of hurt and hope and fear crackling in the air between them. Hi, David said quietly.
Hi.
Can we talk? Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. David set down his bag and moved slowly into the living room, stopping when he was close enough to touch her but still maintaining careful distance. Elena could see the war in his eyes, the desperate want to reach for her warring with his ingrained fear of rejection. I was wrong, he said simply. About everything. About what you could handle, about what I deserved, about what love means. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak. I've been seeing trauma as this permanent stain on my soul, David continued, his voice growing stronger. Something that made me fundamentally unworthy of good things. But today I realized that trauma isn't who I am. It's something that happened to me. And what I do with it, how I let it shape my life, that's my choice. David. Let me finish, he said gently. Please. I need to say this. Elena nodded. I choose you, David said, and the words rang with conviction. I choose us. I choose the hard work and the setbacks and the nights when we don't know how to comfort each other. I choose learning how to be married together, messily and imperfectly and real. He held up his wedding ring, the simple gold band catching the lamplight. I never put this on, he said. During our ceremony, after the hospital. I never made that commitment real. But I want to now. If you'll let me. If you'll have me back. Elena stood up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. What's different now? What's changed? David's smile was rueful, self-aware. I realized that the thing I was most afraid of had already happened. I'd already lost you by trying not to lose you. And I realized that I'd rather fail at being your husband than succeed at being alone. Elena stepped closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerable hope he was trying so hard not to hide. You didn't lose me, she said softly. You hurt me, and you scared me, but you didn't lose me. I meant what I said in that text. I love you. That's not conditional on you being perfect or healed or easy to love. David's breath caught. Elena. But I need to know that you're choosing me too. Really choosing me. Not because you think you owe me something, or because you feel guilty, but because you want to build a life with me. I do, David said without hesitation. I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life, even on the mornings when one of us had nightmares. I want to learn how to comfort you and how to let you comfort me. I want to fight and make up and figure out whose turn it is to do dishes and complain about your terrible taste in reality TV. Elena laughed despite her tears. My taste in reality TV is excellent. See? We're going to fight about that for decades. David's smile was soft, hopeful. If you'll have me. Elena reached out and took the ring from his palm, her fingers closing around the warm metal. Ask me, she said quietly. What? Ask me to marry you. For real this time. Not because we're supposed to, or because we've already had the wedding, but because you want to choose me every day for the rest of your life. David's eyes filled with tears. He dropped to one knee right there in their living room, taking Elena's free hand in both of his. Elena Martinez Chen, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Will you marry me? Will you choose the hard work and the healing and the beautiful messiness of building a life together? Will you let me spend every day for the rest of my life learning how to love you better? Elena was crying now, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you. Again and again and again." David stood and kissed her then, soft and reverent and full of promise. When they broke apart, Elena slipped his wedding ring onto his finger, the motion careful and ceremonial. "There," she said, pressing a kiss to his knuckles. "Now you're really my husband." David looked down at the ring, then back at Elena's face. "And you're really my wife. How does it feel?" Elena asked. David considered the question seriously. "Terrifying," he said honestly. "And perfect." "What would you choose, the safety of walls, or the terrifying beauty of being truly known?" Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't conquering our fears, but choosing love anyway. When have you had to choose between fear and hope? Outside their window, the city sparkled in the evening light, full of possibilities and new beginnings. But inside their apartment, two people who had almost lost each other were finally ready to begin the real work of marriage. Not the fantasy version, but the messy, complicated, beautiful reality of choosing love every single day. 6 months later, Elena woke to the sound of David having a nightmare. But this time, she knew what to do. She didn't touch him. That had taken weeks to learn, that his night terrors required space first, not contact. Instead, she spoke his name softly, repeatedly, her voice a lighthouse calling him back to shore. "David. David, you're safe. You're home. I'm here." His thrashing gradually stilled, his breathing slowly evening out. When his eyes finally opened, they found hers immediately in the pre-dawn darkness. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse from whatever demons had visited his sleep. "I'm here," she said simply. "You're safe." This had become their ritual, not the nightmare, but the aftermath. The gentle words, the patient waiting, the slow return to each other. David rolled toward her, and Elena opened her arms, letting him decide how much contact he needed. Tonight, he chose to press his face against her neck, his body gradually relaxing as her familiar scent and warmth grounded him in the present. "Bad one?" Elena asked softly, her fingers threading through his hair. "Different," David murmured against her skin. "I was 15 again, but you were there too. And I couldn't protect you." Elena's heart clenched, but her voice remained steady. "You don't have to protect me from your past, David. That's not your job." "I know." David pulled back to look at her, his eyes clearer now. "Dr. Williams says the nightmares are changing because my relationship with the trauma is changing. That having you there, even in my subconscious, means I'm not facing it alone anymore." Elena smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Smart woman." "Yeah, well, she's been right about most things." David's smile was rueful. "Including the part about marriage being harder than I thought it would be." Elena laughed softly. "Was that before or after you reorganized my entire spice cabinet without asking?" "That was an act of love," David protested. "Alphabetical order is a gift to humanity." And was it also an act of love when you color-coded my bookshelves?" "Absolutely. You should be thanking me." This was new too, the teasing, the easy intimacy of couples who'd learned to fight and make up, who discovered that love didn't eliminate personality quirks but made them endearing instead of irritating. They'd had their first real fight 6 weeks after David came home, about money, of all mundane things. Elena was a spender, David was a saver, and their first joint bank statement had been a revelation. The fight had been loud, passionate, and utterly normal, and when it was over, David had stared at Elena in amazement. "We fought," he'd said wonderingly. "Yes, we did," Elena had replied, still annoyed about his criticism of her shoe budget. "And we're still married." "Unfortunately." David had grinned then, the expression so bright and incredulous that Elena's irritation had melted away. "We fought, and we're still married, and you're not leaving." "Well, not over shoes," Elena had conceded. "Ask me again when you reorganize my closet." He had, in fact, reorganized her closet 2 weeks later. The fight that followed had been even more spectacular, and the make-up sex afterward had been their first real breakthrough in physical intimacy, messy, awkward, and absolutely perfect in its imperfection. Now, lying in their bed as the sun began to paint the sky beyond their windows, Elena traced lazy patterns on David's chest and marveled at how far they'd come. "What are you thinking about?" David asked, his voice drowsy and content. "Our wedding night," Elena said. David's hand stilled in her hair. Even now, 6 months later, the memory could still make him tense. Which one? Elena propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. All of them. The disaster, the hospital, the night you came home. I was thinking about how none of them looked anything like what I'd imagined when I was a little girl. I'm sorry. Don't you dare apologize, Elena cut him off firmly. I was thinking about how grateful I am that they didn't. David's eyebrows rose. Grateful. The fantasy wedding night is about perfection, right? Two people who fit together seamlessly, who don't have any baggage or complications or trauma. It's about easy love. Elena's smile was soft, contemplative. But easy love doesn't teach you anything. It doesn't make you grow or stretch or discover parts of yourself you didn't know existed. David was quiet, listening. Our wedding night taught me that love isn't about finding someone who doesn't challenge you, Elena continued. It's about finding someone worth being challenged by. Someone worth fighting for, even when, especially when, the fighting is hard. David reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. Even when one of you is a mess. Especially then. Elena leaned into his touch. David, do you remember what you said to me in the hospital? About not knowing how to be a husband? I remember. I've been thinking about that lately, about how terrified we both were that we didn't know what we were doing. But I think that's the point. I think that's what makes it ours. David's expression grew thoughtful. What do you mean? I mean that every couple has to figure out their own version of marriage. The couple down the hall who never fight but also never seem to really see each other, that works for them. James and Anna with their easy affection and their synchronized life, that works for them. But we're not them. Elena shifted closer, her body warm against his. We're the couple who learn to love each other through panic attacks and hospital visits and spectacularly messy emotional breakdowns. We're the couple who had to rebuild trust from the ground up, who had to learn that intimacy doesn't mean the absence of fear, it means choosing each other despite the fear. David's eyes were bright with unshed tears. We're the couple who had 3 wedding nights. And counting, Elena added with a grin. I'm thinking we might need to make it an annual tradition. Every year on our anniversary, we get to choose each other all over again. Every year. Every day, if we're lucky. David rolled then, pulling Elena beneath him, his weight warm and familiar and safe. 6 months ago, this position would have sent him into a panic attack. Now, it just felt like coming home. I love you, he said, the words carrying the weight of every obstacle they'd overcome, every choice they'd made to stay. I love you too, Elena replied, her hands framing his face. All of you. The parts that are healed and the parts that are healing and the parts that might always carry scars. David kissed her then, deep and slow and full of promise. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. Mrs. Chen, he said softly. Mr. Chen, she replied, smiling. How do you feel about breakfast in bed? I feel like you're trying to distract me from the fact that it's your turn to do the dishes. Is it working? Elena laughed, the sound bright and joyful in the morning light. Maybe a little. Later, as they sat in their kitchen sharing coffee and burned toast, David's culinary skills were still a work in progress. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from Carmen. How's married life? Still disgustingly happy. Elena showed the message to David, who grinned and took her phone. His reply was simple, learning every day. It's perfect. Carmen's response came immediately. Gross. I love you both. When are you making me an aunt? Elena and David exchanged a look, a whole conversation in a single glance. They'd started talking about children recently, tentatively at first, then with growing excitement. Dr. Williams had been working with David on his fears about fatherhood, helping him separate his father's actions from his own capacity for love. Maybe next year. Elena said quietly. Maybe next year, David agreed, his smile soft and wondering. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, reading the news on their phones, occasionally sharing funny articles or reaching across the small table to touch hands or steal bites of each other's toast. It was utterly ordinary and absolutely precious, the kind of morning Elena had dreamed about but never quite believed she'd have. The doorbell rang as they were loading the dishwasher, and David went to answer it while Elena finished wiping down the counters. She heard voices in the hallway, David's and someone else's, and then David was back with a massive flower arrangement and a bemused expression. Secret admirer. Elena teased. Read the card, David said, handing her the small envelope. Elena opened it and immediately started laughing. The card was from their wedding planner, Mrs. Rodriguez, and it read, "Congratulations on your 6-month anniversary. I've been in this business for 20 years, and I've never seen a couple fight harder for their love. Here's to many more years of choosing each other. P.S. The balcony at the Fairmorn has been completely renovated. Thought you should know." She's been keeping track, David said, shaking his head in amazement. She probably has bets going with the other wedding planners about whether we'd make it, Elena said, still giggling. Smart money was probably against us. Their loss, Elena said firmly, wrapping her arms around David's waist. We're the comeback story of the century. David pulled her closer, marveling as he always did at how perfectly she fit against him, how her presence could calm the restless anxiety that had been his constant companion for so many years. Elena. Yeah. Thank you. For what? David was quiet for a moment, searching for the right words. For not giving up on us. For seeing something worth fighting for when I couldn't see it myself. For choosing me every day, even when I was too scared to choose myself. Elena pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with love and something that looked like pride. You want to know a secret, she said softly. Always. You were never the one who needed saving, David. We both were. We just saved each other. David stared at her, this incredible woman who'd taken his broken pieces and helped him build something beautiful from the wreckage. Who'd seen his scars and called them proof of survival rather than evidence of damage. I have an idea, he said suddenly. Yeah. What if we renewed our vows? Not because anything's wrong, but because everything's right. Because we want to make promises we actually understand this time. Elena's face lit up. When? Today. Right now. Right here in our kitchen where we learned how to fight and make up and choose each other every morning. Elena grinned, already reaching for David's hands. I think that's the most romantic thing you've ever said. They stood there in their kitchen, still in their pajamas, hair messy and feet bare, and spoke the words that had been in their hearts all along but that they'd been too afraid to say the first time around. I choose you, David said, his voice steady and sure. Not because you're perfect, but because you're perfectly mine. I choose the hard conversations and the healing that never quite ends and the way you reorganize the dishwasher after I load it because you have strong opinions about silverware placement. Elena laughed through her tears. I choose you, she said, because you see my anxiety as something to be managed, not cured. Because you learned my triggers and my love language and the exact right way to make coffee in the morning. Because you came back when you could have run, and you keep choosing to stay. I promise, David continued, to trust you with my broken places. To believe that you love me not despite my scars, but with full knowledge of how I got them. To let you help carry the weight when it gets too heavy for me alone. I promise, Elena said, to be patient with your healing and to never make you feel ashamed for having bad days. To fight for us when you're too scared to fight for yourself, and to trust you to do the same for me. To build a life with you that's messy and real and ours. I promise, they said together, to choose each other every day, in every season, through every challenge. To love each other exactly as we are, and exactly as we're becoming. They sealed their vows with a kiss that tasted like coffee and burnt toast and the salt of happy tears. Outside their window, the world went about its business. People rushing to work, children walking to school, life in all its ordinary complexity continuing its eternal rhythm. But inside their kitchen, two people who'd almost lost each other were finally, truly beginning their love story. What does it mean to love someone not despite their scars, but because of how those scars have shaped their capacity for tenderness? Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding your other half, but about two whole people choosing to build something beautiful together. Later that evening, as they curled up on the couch to watch Elena's terrible reality TV, David had learned to find it charming. Elena's head on David's shoulder and his fingers tracing absent patterns on her arm, David thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago. That man had been so afraid of being broken that he'd almost broken the most beautiful thing in his life. He'd been so convinced he was unworthy of love that he'd nearly missed the miracle of being loved exactly as he was. What are you thinking about? Elena asked, looking up at him with those dark eyes that had seen him at his worst and chosen to stay anyway. I'm thinking, David said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, that our real wedding night was worth waiting for. Elena smiled, snuggling closer. Which one? All of them, David said, echoing her words from that morning. Every single one. Outside, the city twinkled with a million lights, each one representing someone else's story. Their struggles and triumphs, their love and loss, their own journey toward connection. But inside this small apartment, two people had found what they'd been searching for all along. Not perfect love, but real love. Not easy love, but lasting love. Love at last, in all its complicated, challenging, absolutely perfect imperfection. The story of David and Elena Chen was just beginning, and it was going to be beautiful.